10:43 p.m. A 911 call comes in from a quiet home in Athol, Idaho. A man's voice is on the line. Calm, controlled, almost rehearsed.
Hello?
Trying to do CPR. I can't.
Okay, listen to me. Can you tell me what your address is?
He tells dispatchers something horrifying. His wife, Kendy Howard, is in the bathtub. She has a gunshot wound to the mouth, and he believes she's dead. Within minutes, deputies arrive. The scene looks tragic. A woman lying lifeless in the bath. A firearm nearby. A husband in shock. A suicide. That is what it looks like. That is what everyone assumes. Until 2 years later, that same husband is arrested for murder. But not just any husband. Dan Howard, a former Idaho State Police trooper. A man trained to investigate crime scenes like this. And according to prosecutors, he didn't just find the scene. But the most disturbing question wasn't how she died. It was this: if Kendy Howard didn't pull the trigger, then who did? And why did everything about the scene look so carefully arranged? One clue would change everything. A dryer still running with 6 minutes left on the cycle. Before the sirens. Before the investigation. Before the courtroom battle, there was Kendy Howard. She was 52 years old. Described by friends as warm, outgoing, and deeply family-oriented. She wasn't someone who stayed in the shadows. She was active, social, and loved by her children and grandchildren, but behind closed doors, her marriage was beginning to fracture. Before Dan Howard became a murder suspect, before Kendy Howard's death became the center of a 2-year investigation, the couple had spent most of their adult lives together. Dan and Kendy Howard married in 1994. By the time of Kendy's death in 2021, they had been married for approximately 26 years. To outsiders, they appeared to have built a successful life. Dan spent years serving in law enforcement as an Idaho State Police trooper. Later, he left the force and began working in Alaska's oil fields, often spending 3 weeks at a time away from home before returning to Idaho. Kendy focused on her family. Friends described her as devoted to her children and grandchildren. Her daughter, Brooke Wilkins, later told jurors that her mother was not only her best friend but also a role model and an important part of her granddaughter's life. For years, the marriage appeared stable. But behind closed doors, cracks had already begun to form. And by 2020, those cracks were becoming impossible to hide. Dan Howard wasn't an ordinary husband. He was a former Idaho State Police trooper. Years in law enforcement. Years learning how crime scenes work, how suspects think, and how evidence is interpreted. He knew exactly what investigators look for. And more importantly, he knew how scenes can be staged. To everyone outside, the marriage looked normal. But investigators would later describe it very differently. Controlled, tense, and deteriorating. As her marriage deteriorated, Kendy began imagining a different future. According to testimony presented during trial, she wanted to move back to her hometown of Kamei, Idaho. She had started looking at houses. She was exploring the possibility of opening an antique store. And for the first time in years, she was seriously planning a life without Dan Howard. But there was another secret. One that prosecutors believed would become a major trigger in the case. Kendy had reconnected with a man named Daniel Pardo. The two had known each other since middle school. They dated in high school, lost touch, and decades later, rekindled their relationship. According to Pardo's testimony, the two fell deeply in love. But their relationship had to remain hidden. Kendy was still married, and she was terrified of how Dan might react if he learned the truth. Prosecutors would later argue that Dan eventually discovered both the affair and Kendy's plans for divorce. And that discovery changed everything. Only days before her death, something happened that would later terrify investigators. On January 28, 2021, Kendy picked Dan up from the airport after one of his work trips to Alaska. During the drive, she told him she wanted a divorce. According to a friend, Kendy later described Dan's reaction as not good. Then things became even stranger. In the early morning hours of January 29, Kendy called Daniel Pardo in distress. He later testified that she sounded frightened. He could hear Dan's voice in the background. He heard what sounded like a struggle. Then the call abruptly ended. Concerned, Pardo contacted Kendy's parents. Her parents called 911. Deputies arrived at the Howard residence to conduct a welfare check. What happened next would become one of the most chilling moments in the entire case. Later that day, Kendy told friends she woke up and found Dan standing over her bed. He was dressed in dark clothing and wearing gloves. Nearby, she noticed a gun magazine on the floor. According to witnesses, Kendy believed her husband was going to kill her. One friend later testified she was scared to death. That night, everything changed. Dan Howard called 911. He reported his wife had shot herself in the bathtub. Deputies arrived quickly. Inside the bathroom, Kendy Howard was found naked in the tub. A gunshot wound to the mouth. A firearm nearby. The water still present. At first glance, it fit the narrative of suicide. But something about the scene didn't sit right. Because trained eyes noticed details that didn't belong. And one of them was unexpected. A dryer was still running inside the house. The dryer display showed 6 minutes remaining. A detective paused. That detail would become critical. Investigators later checked the machine's cycle timing. They calculated backward. The dryer had been started at approximately 10:42 p.m. Just 1 minute before Dan Howard called 911. Think about that. A man discovers his wife has allegedly shot herself. And at the same time, a dryer is started. That contradiction planted the first real doubt. Investigators expanded their analysis. And more inconsistencies appeared. The positioning of the body. The condition of the bathroom. The timing of the call. And most importantly, the medical evidence. Because what looked like suicide was starting to look very different under forensic review. Forensic experts reached a chilling conclusion. Kendy Howard may have already been dead before the gun was fired. According to the prosecution theory, the cause of death was not the gunshot. It was asphyxiation, neck compression, loss of oxygen to the brain. And that led investigators to a disturbing possibility. A technique Dan Howard would have known well, a carotid restraint. Prosecutors argued Dan Howard used a trained law enforcement technique. A carotid restraint compresses blood flow through the neck arteries. It can cause unconsciousness in seconds, and death if sustained. The theory presented in court was this: a struggle occurred, the restraint was applied and Kendy lost consciousness. She died, and only after that was the gun introduced to stage a suicide. Behind the forensic evidence, a human story was unraveling. Kendy Howard was reportedly preparing to leave. She had spoken to a divorce attorney. She was making plans for a new life. And according to testimony, there was also another relationship involved. Divorce meant financial consequences, approximately $2 million in shared assets. And prosecutors argued that became the breaking point. Jealousy, control, fear of loss. One question many viewers ask is, if investigators were suspicious from the beginning, why wasn't Dan Howard arrested immediately? The answer lies in the complexity of the forensic evidence. Initially, Kendy's death was difficult to classify. The original medical examiner believed the gunshot wound could have been fatal. But as additional experts reviewed the case, serious questions began emerging. The Kootenai County coroner ultimately classified the cause of death as undetermined. That decision prevented the case from being closed as a suicide. Investigators then launched an extensive review. They re-examined crime scene photographs, 911 recordings, body camera footage, forensic evidence, medical opinions, timeline reconstructions, and eventually, the suicide theory began collapsing under the weight of new findings. This case didn't break overnight. It took more than 2 years. Investigators brought in forensic specialists, medical experts, crime scene reconstruction analysts, and timeline investigators. Piece by piece, they dismantled the suicide narrative until nothing remained stable. April 2023, a grand jury indicted Dan Howard. He surrendered to authorities, charged with murder. The former investigator had now become the suspect. But the case was far from over. March 2024. The trial began. During the 3-week trial, jurors heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. Some of the most important included Brooke Wilkins, Kendy's daughter, who described her mother as happy, loving, and excited about the future. Daniel Pardo, the man Kendy planned to build a new life with. He testified about their relationship, her plans for divorce, and her fear of Dan Howard. Michelle Lampert, a close friend who described Kendy's excitement about starting over and testified that Kendy feared her husband. Forensic medical experts who challenged the suicide theory and argued the evidence pointed toward homicide. Bloodstain experts who testified that Kendy's body had been moved after death. Together, these witnesses transformed what once appeared to be a suicide into a murder case. The defense insisted Kendy took her own life, but prosecutors argued the scene was staged, the timeline was manipulated, and the evidence told a different story. Then came the verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and domestic battery. Dan Howard was sentenced to life in prison without parole. There was no dramatic confession, no recorded admission, no final explanation, just a quiet house, a bathtub, a staged scene, and a detail most people would have ignored: a dryer. With 6 minutes left. After the guilty verdict, Kendy's family finally had the opportunity to address the court. They spoke about the loss of a mother, a grandmother, a friend, a woman whose future had been stolen. Then Judge Lamont Berex delivered his sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described Dan Howard as a remorseless killer. After more than 3 years of uncertainty, the legal battle was over. But for Kendy Howard's family, the loss would remain permanent. Because sometimes, the smallest detail doesn't just raise suspicion. It destroys an entire story. What do you think really happened in this case? Was justice served? Or is there still something we're missing? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep cinematic true crime documentaries like this, subscribe to the channel. Because every case has a story, but not every story is what it seems.